Lieutenant Kai Rivera never planned on making military history by dying. At least, not repeatedly. As he stared at the pulsing reactor core of Europa Station through the reinforced glass of Maintenance Bay 7, he had no idea his routine inspection would change the course of humanity's war against the stars. Core temperature nominal, Lieutenant, reported Technical Specialist Reza Patel, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic readouts floating before her. Ready for maintenance cycle. Acknowledged, Rivera responded, checking the seals on his environment suit one final time. Beginning interior inspection sequence. The maintenance bay's airlock cycled with a familiar hiss. Rivera had performed this inspection dozens of times before, a standard procedure to ensure the station's antimatter containment systems remained stable. Europa Station served as humanity's furthest permanent outpost in the solar system, and its experimental reactor core kept the lights on and the ice from creeping in. That's when everything went wrong. Later, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Walsh would describe the incident as an unprecedented demonstration of human adaptation to extreme circumstances. Rivera preferred to call it his first death. The reactor's magnetic containment field flickered, just for a microsecond. In that instant, a surge of radiation unlike anything in human experience swept through the maintenance bay. Rivera felt it before the alarms even started screaming, a sensation like being turned inside out while simultaneously being compressed into a singular point of existence. Lieutenant. Your vitals, Patel's voice cut through the static of his comm system, panic evident even through the distortion. You're dead, Rivera finished for her, surprising himself by still being able to speak. Yeah, I noticed. The medical readouts confirmed it. No heartbeat. No brain activity. No biological functions whatsoever. Yet somehow, Rivera remained conscious, aware, and most puzzlingly, still standing. This is inconvenient, he managed, watching his suit's medical display flash with increasingly urgent warnings about his complete lack of life signs. Dr. Himiko Tanaka, Europa Station's chief medical officer, would later spend hours trying to explain what happened next. The human body, she would write in her report, apparently has undocumented survival mechanisms that activate under extreme circumstances. Lieutenant Rivera's consciousness somehow remained intact while his biological functions ceased, a state previously thought impossible. Rivera experienced it differently. To him, it felt like his body had simply decided to take a brief vacation from being alive, while his mind stayed behind to keep an eye on things. After exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds, every system in his body restarted simultaneously, as if someone had hit a universal reset button. The ensuing chaos in the medical bay would have been entertaining if Rivera hadn't been the center of it. Dr. Tanaka ran every test in the medical database and invented several new ones on the spot. Military intelligence dispatched a team from Earth within hours, breaking several space travel speed records in the process. Let me get this straight, Colonel Walsh said during the first debriefing, his weathered face betraying a mix of disbelief and strategic calculation. You died. Yes, sir. But you got better. That's one way to put it, sir. And you remained conscious throughout the entire experience? Yes, sir. I could see, hear, and think clearly. I just wasn't, technically speaking, alive. Walsh leaned back in his chair, steel-gray eyes studying Rivera with newfound interest. Lieutenant, how do you feel about classified assignments? That's when Rivera learned about the Voidborn. Humanity hadn't broadcast the news widely, but 3 outer colonies had gone silent in the past month. The few surveillance feeds that made it back to command showed massive organic ships that seemed to phase in and out of reality, ships that could detect and track human life signs from astronomical distances. We need a way to move our forces without being detected, Walsh explained, spreading holographic star charts across the briefing room table. We need soldiers who can approach their ships without registering as living beings. You need someone who can die on command, Rivera finished, beginning to understand why his bizarre condition had attracted such immediate military attention. Precisely, Lieutenant. How would you like to make history again? That night, as Rivera lay in his quarters staring at Europa's ice-covered surface through his viewport, he realized something that would prove prophetic: learning to die might be the easy part. Learning to use death as a weapon, that would be the real challenge. Within 24 hours, Project Lazarus was officially launched, with Rivera as its first and only operative. As Dr. Tanaka began designing protocols to help him control his new ability, and Colonel Walsh drafted mission parameters that had never before existed in military history, Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He was right. The war against the Voidborn would require sacrifices no one had ever imagined possible. And Lieutenant Kai Rivera, the man who learned to die, would lead the charge into this new frontier of human warfare. Lieutenant Rivera stared at her from the medical bay's observation chamber. You know, most doctors try to prevent that. Most doctors don't have patients who can resurrect themselves, she replied, adjusting her monitoring equipment. Now, please expire. For science. Project Phoenix, formerly Project Lazarus until someone pointed out that coming back from the dead repeatedly was more Phoenix-like, had transformed Europa Station's medical wing into something between a military training facility and a metaphysical research center. The walls were lined with sensors designed to measure everything from quantum fluctuations to spiritual energy, though Rivera suspected the latter was Dr. Tanaka's idea of a joke. Initiating death sequence, Rivera announced, only half sarcastically. He had discovered that treating his unique ability with humor helped keep the existential dread at bay. He closed his eyes, focused on the now familiar sensation of his consciousness detaching from his physical form, and stopped being alive. Remarkable, Dr. Tanaka muttered, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. Complete cellular stasis achieved in 2.3 seconds. That's a new record, Lieutenant. Rivera would have smiled if his facial muscles were currently operating. He'd gotten better at this over the past 3 weeks of training. What had initially been an involuntary response to extreme radiation had become something he could control with increasing precision. Biological function ceased, but neural activity remains consistent, reported Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, the quantum physicist who'd been assigned to study the phenomenon. It's like his consciousness exists in a state of quantum superposition. He's both dead and alive, Dr. Tanaka agreed. Schrödinger would have loved this. Rivera permitted himself exactly 3 minutes of death before initiating revival. The process felt like booting up a complex computer system, everything coming online in a carefully orchestrated sequence. How are the Voidborn readings? He asked once his vocal cords were functioning again. Harrison gestured to a separate set of monitors. They'd captured one of the alien bioship's scanning probes last week, and had been using it to test Rivera's detectability. Complete invisibility during death state. You might as well not exist as far as their technology is concerned. Colonel Walsh, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally spoke. Are we ready for field trials? Dr. Tanaka hesitated. Sir, while the lieutenant has shown remarkable progress. The Voidborn just took Ganymede Colony, Walsh interrupted. 7,000 civilians. We're running out of time. The room fell silent. Rivera sat up on the examination table, his mind racing. He'd seen the classified footage from Ganymede. The Voidborn ships had appeared from nowhere, their massive organic forms rippling with impossible colors. Their bioscanners had mapped the entire colony in seconds, targeting every human life sign with terrifying precision. I'm ready, Rivera said firmly. Lieutenant, Dr. Tanaka protested, we still don't understand the long-term effects of repeated death states on your system. With respect, Doctor, we don't have time to understand everything. Rivera stood, facing Walsh. What's the mission, sir? Walsh activated a tactical display. We've detected Voidborn activity near Titan. Intelligence suggests they're preparing for another colony strike. We need to get a team close enough to place quantum beacons on their ships. If we can track their phase signatures. We can predict where they'll appear next, Rivera finished. And I'm the only one who can get close enough without being detected. Correct. You'll lead a small team. While you're in death state, you'll carry them through the void-borne detection grid. Walsh's expression was grim. It's never been attempted. Most things I do these days haven't been attempted, sir. The mission was codenamed Operation Shadow Step. The team spent the next 48 hours preparing, testing equipment modified to function in Rivera's no-life field. They discovered that anything in direct contact with him during death state shared his undetectable properties, a phenomenon Harrison called quantum mortality sharing. The night before deployment, Rivera couldn't sleep. He stood at his usual viewport, watching Jupiter's massive form dominate the horizon. Dr. Tanaka found him there. "You should rest," she said softly. "I'll be dead soon enough," he replied with a wry smile. "Plenty of rest then." "That's not funny." "It's a little funny." Tanaka moved to stand beside him. "We still don't know why you survived that reactor surge. Why you can do what you do. The other test subjects." She didn't need to finish. They'd tried to replicate Rivera's ability in volunteers. The results had been unfortunate. "Maybe we're not meant to understand it," Rivera said. "Maybe we just need to use it." "Just." Tanaka hesitated. "Come back." "All the way back." Rivera nodded, watching Europa's icy surface reflect distant starlight. Tomorrow he would lead 4 soldiers into the darkness between worlds, carrying them through death to strike at an enemy that humanity barely understood. He was no longer just the man who learned to die, he was the weapon that death had become. The Voidborn were about to learn that humans could be far more terrifying than any alien horror. Sometimes, Rivera reflected, the most powerful weapons weren't the ones that killed. They were the ones that could come back from death itself. The void between Saturn and Titan wasn't meant to be experienced by human senses. As Lieutenant Rivera watched the massive organic forms of void-borne ships twist through space before him, he realized this was probably why the aliens had chosen this region for their staging ground. "Everybody ready," he whispered into his comm, though sound couldn't travel in the vacuum anyway. His team, Sergeants Yuki Yamamoto and Omar Hassan, along with Corporals Dante Romano and Wei Chen, clicked their acknowledgement lights in sequence. They were strapped to Rivera's modified EVA suit in a tight formation, looking like some strange deep space chrysalis. The quantum tethers connecting them would ensure they shared his death state, making them invisible to void-borne bioscanners. Beginning death sequence in 3, 2, 1. Rivera had done this dozens of times in training, but never in deep space. Never while carrying 4 other lives. The sensation was different here, more profound. As his biological functions ceased, he felt the quantum field expand, enveloping his team. Through his helmet's display, he watched their life signs fade to nothing. Status check, he managed, his consciousness floating in the strange space between life and death. 4 green lights pulsed in response. They were alive but not, existing in Rivera's carefully maintained bubble of temporary mortality. The nearest void-borne vessel, a massive structure that resembled a cross between a manta ray and a cathedral, drifted less than a kilometer away. "Beginning approach," Rivera announced. Their maneuvering thrusters were specially modified to work in death state, pushing the team silently through the void. The void-borne ship's surface was a nightmare of organic architecture, rippling flesh metal that pulsed with internal light. As they drew closer, Rivera could see what looked like veins carrying luminescent fluids through the vessel's skin. "Beacon placement points marked," Yamamoto reported, her voice carrying the slight echo that characterized speech in death state. 300 meters to first target. That's when everything went sideways. A new void-borne ship phased into existence directly above them, its massive form distorting space itself as it arrived. The team's death state protected them from detection, but not from physics. The gravitational wave from the ship's arrival sent them tumbling. "Stabilize," Rivera ordered, fighting to maintain his concentration. Losing Death State now would be catastrophic. Hassan, Romano, thrusters. They managed to arrest their spin, but they drifted dangerously close to the ship's biomechanical surface. Rivera could see structures that looked disturbingly like eyes opening and closing across the hull. "Sir," Chen's voice was tight with controlled fear, "those aren't eyes. They're defensive pods." He was right. The structures were beginning to bulge outward, preparing to launch whatever passed for fighters in void-born biology. "New plan," Rivera announced. "We're going inside." "Inside?" Romano's disbelief was clear even through the calm static. "Sir, with all due respect. Those pods are going to flood this entire sector. Our best chance is to find cover inside the ship until they disperse." Rivera was already maneuvering them toward what appeared to be a maintenance aperture. "Unless anyone has a better idea?" Silence answered him. They all knew their small craft, hidden at the mission's staging point, couldn't reach them in time. The aperture was a sphincter-like opening, pulsing with the same bioluminescent fluid that ran through the ship's veins. Rivera led them through just as the first defense pods began to burst open behind them. The interior of a void-born ship defied human comprehension. Corridors shifted and breathed, walls rippled with patterns that hurt the eyes, and gravity seemed to be more of a suggestion than a law. "Keep tight formation," Rivera warned. "I don't know how long I can maintain Death State in here." They moved through the living vessel like ghosts, passing bizarre structures that might have been organs or machinery or both. Occasionally, they glimpsed movements that suggested crew, but the void-born themselves remained unseen. "Sir," Yamamoto's voice was barely a whisper, "look at these readings." The ship's internal systems were completely exposed to their sensors. Neural pathways, energy conduits, command signals, everything. "This is better than beacons," Hassan realized. "We're seeing their entire biological operating system." Rivera made a decision. "New mission parameters. We're going to central control, wherever that is. Chen, can you track these neural pathways?" "Already on it, sir. Major cluster of activity 200 meters, that way." He pointed toward what looked like a vertical shaft of pulsing light. They moved carefully, aware that one slip in Rivera's concentration could reveal them. The strain of maintaining Death State for so long was beginning to tell, a deep fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. The central nervous system of the void-born ship was a cathedral-like space, with what appeared to be a living computer core suspended in a web of neural tissues. As the team watched, they saw their first actual void-born, creatures of impossible geometry that phased in and out of normal space as they worked. "Planting data miners," Yamamoto reported, carefully attaching quantum devices to the neural web. "Sir, your readings are fluctuating." Rivera could feel it. Maintaining Death State was becoming harder by the second. Whether it was fatigue or something about this place, he was reaching his limit. "How long for the data transfer?" 3 minutes. "You have 2. Rivera concentrated harder, feeling something dangerous building in his chest. "Because that's all I've got." Those 2 minutes were the longest of Rivera's career. As Yamamoto and Chen worked, he could feel his grasp on Death State slipping. Sweat would have been pouring down his face if his body were capable of producing it. "Transfer complete. Exit plan Bravo," Rivera ordered. "Now." They retraced their path at dangerous speed, Rivera's control slipping with every meter. They burst from the maintenance aperture just as his Death State began to collapse. "Emergency resurrection protocols," he gasped, feeling life flood back into his body with painful intensity. The team's life signs surged back online as they pushed away from the void-born vessel. Behind them, alarms began to pulse through the living ship's flesh. They'd been detected, but too late. The data was already transmitted to their waiting craft. As they rendezvoused with their ship and escaped into the shadow of Titan, Rivera realized they just changed the course of the war. They hadn't just gathered intelligence, they'd seen inside the enemy, understood their biology, their weaknesses. The Voidborn had evolved to detect and destroy life. Now humanity knew how to become death itself. Lieutenant Rivera stood at the observation window of Testing Chamber 3, watching another volunteer convulse on the medical bed. Dr. Tanaka and her team rushed to stabilize the soldier as his attempt to achieve death state went catastrophically wrong. Reverting cellular decay, Tanaka's voice was sharp with focus. Quantum field collapsing. Get me a neural stabilizer. Colonel Walsh stood beside Rivera, his face carved from stone. But it worked for you. Maybe that's the problem, sir. Rivera turned to face his commander. We're trying to replicate something we don't understand. The reactor accident that gave me this ability, it was random, chaotic. We're being too mathematical about this. 3 months had passed since Operation Deadfall. The intelligence gathered from inside the Voidborn ship had proved invaluable, leading to the first successful defensive operations against the alien threat. But everyone knew that one operative who could achieve death state wasn't enough. Project Phoenix had expanded, consuming entire decks of Europa Station. Hundreds of volunteers had come forward, willing to risk death for the chance to become like Rivera. None had survived the attempt. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera, Walsh corrected him. Your promotion came through this morning. Rivera barely registered the news. Below, the medical team had stabilized the volunteer, but the soldier's career in the program was over. Another failure. Another life nearly lost. Sir, I have an idea, Rivera said slowly. But you're not going to like it. 24 hours later, Rivera stood in the reactor maintenance bay where it had all begun. Lieutenant Commander Harrison had reconfigured the containment fields to recreate the original accident, more or less. This is insane, Dr. Tanaka protested. We can't just expose people to random radiation bursts and hope they develop abilities. That's exactly what we're going to do, Rivera replied. But with one difference. He gestured to the modified quantum tethers attached to his suit. They'll be connected to me when it happens. The theory was simple. Rivera's death state might be able to guide others through the transformation, like a quantum template. It was dangerous, unprecedented, and possibly suicidal. The first volunteer was Sergeant Yamamoto. She'd been part of the Titan mission and had felt the death state through Rivera's quantum field. Ready when you are, sir, she said, checking her tether. Rivera nodded, initiating death state. The familiar sensation of non-existence washed over him as the reactor containment field began to fluctuate. Through the quantum tether, he could feel Yamamoto's consciousness, her life force pulsing with determination. The radiation burst hit them both. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos, a storm of quantum possibilities and cellular destruction. Rivera held on to death state with everything he had, trying to guide Yamamoto's consciousness through the transformation. Then, impossibly, he felt her consciousness shift. Her vital signs flatlined, but her awareness remained, tethered to his in the space between life and death. It worked, Harrison's voice was filled with wonder. She's achieving stable death state. Over the next month, Rivera guided 7 more soldiers through the transformation. Not everyone survived the attempt, but those who did formed the core of what would become known as the Ghost Division, soldiers who could step between life and death at will. Training them was unlike anything in military history. Rivera watched as his small team learned to control their unique ability, each developing their own style and timing. The key, he explained during one session, is understanding that death isn't an end state. It's a transition, a doorway we can step through and back again. The Ghost Division's first joint operation targeted a void-borne staging area near Neptune. 12 soldiers, moving in perfect synchronization between life and death, infiltrated 3 alien ships simultaneously. The intelligence gathered would help turn the tide of the war. But there was a cost. Each death state took a toll, leaving microscopic quantum scars on their consciousness. Dr. Tanaka's scans showed progressive degradation in their neural patterns. "We're burning out," Rivera admitted to Walsh during a private briefing. "Every time we die, we leave a piece of ourselves behind. Eventually, there won't be enough left to come back." "How long?" "At current mission tempo? 6 months, maybe less." Walsh's expression was grim. "The Voidborn are planning something big. Our deep space probes have detected massive fleet movements. When it comes, we'll need the Ghost Division more than ever. Then we'll be there," Rivera promised. "Whether we can come back or not." That night, Rivera found Yamamoto in the observation lounge, staring at the stars. Like him, she'd begun to feel the effects of repeated death states, a hollowness that grew with each resurrection. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She turned to face him, her eyes holding the strange depth that all Ghost Division soldiers developed, the look of someone who had seen beyond the veil too many times. "No," she answered. "We're protecting humanity. Whatever it costs us, it's worth it." Rivera nodded, understanding completely. They had become something new, not quite human anymore, but perhaps exactly what humanity needed to survive. The Voidborn had evolved to hunt life. Now they faced enemies who had mastered death itself. The final confrontation was coming. The Ghost Division would be ready, even if it meant making their temporary deaths permanent. The Voidborn arrived in force at Saturn's rings, their bioships blotting out the stars. Intelligence hadn't been wrong about them planning something big, but no one had anticipated this. Nearly 1,000 ships, each larger than any they'd encountered before, forming what looked like an invasion fleet. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera stood on Europa Station's command deck, watching the tactical hologram with Dr. Tanaka and Colonel Walsh. The neural degradation in his system had progressed significantly, each death state now felt like tearing away another piece of his soul. "They're not heading for the colonies," Walsh observed, studying the fleet's movement patterns. "They're coming straight for Jupiter. For us. They've identified Europa Station as the source of the Ghost Division," Tanaka added, her face pale. "They're coming to eliminate the threat we pose." Rivera nodded. The Voidborn had evolved over millennia to detect and destroy life. The existence of soldiers who could become death itself represented an evolutionary threat they couldn't ignore. "Status of the Ghost Division?" Walsh asked. 8 combat-ready operators, Rivera reported. 3 more in medical recovery. Neural degradation is accelerating in all of us. He didn't mention that his own readings were the worst, the price of being the first, of leading every major operation. "We can't evacuate the station in time," Walsh said quietly. 40,000 civilians, support staff, and military personnel. Rivera studied the tactical display, an idea forming. A terrible, final idea. "What if we didn't need to evacuate?" he asked. "What if we could extend a death state field around the entire station?" Tanaka's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The energy requirements alone." "The reactor," Rivera interrupted. "The same one that started all this. If we modified it, used our combined abilities to channel its output." "You're talking about putting the entire station into death state," Walsh realized. "Has that even been attempted on that scale?" "No," Rivera admitted. "And the neural load would be..." He didn't finish. They all knew what it meant. Maintaining a field that size would burn out the Ghost Division's neural patterns completely. "No coming back." "There has to be another way," Tanaka protested. "Doctor," Rivera said gently, "we're already dying. Each death state takes us closer to the edge. At least this way, we choose how to use what's left." The next hours were a blur of preparation. The Ghost Division gathered in the reactor control room, each member understanding the magnitude of what they were attempting. Yamamoto stood at Rivera's right hand, her presence steady despite the visible toll of neural degradation. "It's been an honor," she said simply. The Voidborn fleet entered Jupiter's orbit as the station's alarms blared. Rivera looked at his team, soldiers who had learned to die, who had sacrificed pieces of themselves for humanity's survival. They nodded, ready for their final mission. Initiating synchronized death state, Rivera announced. Channel all neural patterns through the reactor's containment field. The sensation was unlike anything they'd experienced. As their combined consciousness interfaced with the reactor's energy, death state began to spread through the station like a wave. Rivera could feel every life force on Europa Station, 40,000 souls suspended between existence and void. Through the observation windows, they watched as the Void-born fleet opened fire, only to have their bioweapons pass harmlessly through the station's quantum field. The entire station had become a ghost, insubstantial as shadow. Field stability at 60%, Harrison reported, his voice strained. Neural patterns degrading rapidly. Rivera could feel it, the final pieces of himself burning away as he helped maintain the massive death state field. Around him, the Ghost Division fought to hold on, their consciousness fragmenting under the enormous load. The Void-born fleet's confusion was visible in their erratic movements. Their entire strategy relied on detecting and targeting life signs. Europa Station had become a void in their perception, an impossibility their evolutionary programming couldn't process. Field stability at 40%, Harrison's voice was barely a whisper now. "Sir, we can't." "Hold on," Rivera ordered, pushing everything he had into maintaining the field. Through their neural link, he could feel his team doing the same, sacrificing their last chance at revival to protect the station. The Void-born ships began to retreat, their biological programming unable to cope with the station's impossible state. As the last ship phased away, Rivera felt the final threads of his consciousness starting to unravel. "Field stability critical," Harrison managed. "We have to terminate." "Not yet," Rivera insisted. "We hold until they're out of range." Complete retreat confirmation. One by one, he felt the Ghost Division's neural patterns fade into true death, not the temporary state they'd mastered, but the final darkness. Yamamoto was the last, her consciousness brushing against his in a final farewell before dissolving. Only when the last Void-born ship vanished into deep space did Rivera allow the field to collapse. As life returned to Europa Station, as 40,000 people gasped their way back to existence, the Ghost Division completed their final sacrifice. Dr. Tanaka found Rivera's body at the reactor controls, a slight smile on his face. The medical logs would show no neural activity, no possibility of revival. He and his team had burned away everything that allowed them to return. The war wasn't over, but humanity had proven something profound. In the face of an enemy that hunted life itself, they had learned to embrace death as a weapon, a shield, and ultimately, a sacrifice. In the years that followed, humanity would expand through the stars, carrying the legend of the Ghost Division, soldiers who died so that others might live, who turned death itself into humanity's most powerful defense. And in the deep silence of space, the Void-born remembered their first defeat, learned to fear the species that had mastered death itself, and knew that humanity would never be easy prey again.